10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3.
This fighter was very nearly called the Shrew, scarcely a name to inspire a nation nor terrify an enemy. Sir Robert McLean of Supermarine wrote, "The name had to begin with an S. I wanted something quarrelsome and troublesome, spitting venom, a thoroughly nasty and unpleasant creature to meet." Shakespeare's Shrew gave me, I thought, the very word, but as I looked again at drawings of the aircraft with its 8 automatic guns, the name flashed into my mind: Spitfire. It's almost exactly 35 years since I first sat in the cockpit of a Spitfire. I was wearing these clothes, including this scarf. I was 19, scared stiff, and fiercely proud to be flying the most beautiful and finest aeroplane in the world. It was never the most comfortable, but that didn't matter. This was a superb fighting aeroplane, and it was a pilot's dream. The story of the Spitfire, which we're going to tell, isn't just a film scenario of a designer working alone inspired by seagulls. Thousands of people all over Britain take part in it. We shall be meeting designers, factory workers, engineers who toiled for months on end in 1940 without a break to get the Spitfires into the sky. The story begins 200 miles from this historic fighter station at Coltishall in Norfolk. The River Itchen in Southampton today carries the hovercraft, another example of British inventive genius. In the 1920s, the thriving firm of Supermarine built flying boats and seaplanes here. Their chief designer was R.J. Mitchell, who provided the seaplane which won the Schneider Trophy for Britain. He went on to the peak of his brilliance by designing the Spitfire, and as all the world knows, he died tragically soon after in 1937. His son stands on the ramp where Supermarine's sleek seaplanes entered the water to compete for the world's speed record in 1931.
The last time that I was standing on this slipway was about 45 years ago. I remember well the anguish and tension which my father showed when the Schneider Trophy planes were wheeled out and the engines revved up. This to me was something which, although I was so young, was a very potent memory. I remember the large floats, the big silver wings. This was all to me, for a boy of 7 or 8 as I was then, something of very great excitement. I perhaps wasn't aware of the real significance of what was going on, but nevertheless I do remember these situations and tensions very, very well.
The RAF team had 2 seaplanes designed by Mitchell to capture the Schneider Trophy outright. The attempt was sponsored by Lady Houston with a gift of £100,000, and she kept alive a partnership between Mitchell and Sir Henry Royce. His firm was responsible for providing a winning power unit. This R engine had the temperament of a thoroughbred. On the night before an earlier race, the Rolls-Royce engineers had faced a most unusual crisis.
They discovered the night before the race that one of the cylinder blocks had seized.
That's right.
And you had to go around and collect all the chaps that we'd taken down to change this block. And we had to get one special man who was left-handed, because it happened to be a block where only a left-handed man could undo the nuts and bolts to change it.
Difficult.
So that Cyril was there, and they went round by taxi and got the police force out, I think, to collect these chaps who'd all had a grand booze up, you know, preparatory to the day out, you know, and they were all, and somebody switched their shoes around in the hotel so that nobody knew the right boots. Anyway, they got them all together, and they changed the cylinder block overnight, which is a considerable job, because the rules were that you could do this, but you couldn't take the engine out of the aeroplane. That was the rule. So they had to do it in situ in the S6 aeroplane, It was done overnight, and the next day, of course, the aeroplane won the race and won the Schneider Trophy for England.
The S6B won, and Mitchell made a rare broadcast about the real value of his triumph.
It is not good enough to follow conventional methods of design. It is essential to break new ground and to invent and involve new methods and new ideas. The important aim of the designer is to reduce air resistance. The cooling of the engine presents many interesting features. The usual methods employed, either by air cooling or by means of honeycomb radiators, have very high air resistance. On the S6B, the engine is cooled without adding any air resistance. The cooling water is circulated over both surfaces of the wings and most of the surface of the floats. During flight, heat equivalent to 1,000 horsepower is being given to the air from these surfaces. The S6B has been aptly described as a flying radiator. For the present, however, it is generally considered that high-speed development has served its purpose. It has accumulated an enormous amount of information which is now being used to improve the breed of everyday aircraft. It is helping to develop our great airliners and ocean-going flying boats, and is thus bringing closer together the outlying parts of the British Empire. This indeed is an objective worthy of all our greatest efforts.
These mementos of success are as modest as Mitchell himself, the man from Stoke-on-Trent who moved to Southampton, where he made his home and his reputation. The government made him a CBE, but never a knight.
As a man, I liked him enormously and respected him because he was tremendously well known. I mean, he had a huge reputation after the Schneider Trophy seaplanes. To me, he was a sort of wonder man. But of course, if you really look back on it and you go through the history of the Schneider Trophy series of seaplanes, the Mitchell and the team which he had built up around him, which incidentally was a very young team, if you go back, very young team. These chaps, after the S4 and the S5 and the two S6s and all the world speed records and everything else, these fellows knew more about high-speed aeronautics than any other design team in the world, I think it is fair to say.
Everybody got a bit of a lift from working with Mitchell because of the success which accompanied his efforts. And he was a good leader, in other words.
Well, RJ would normally, on a bit of new design, would gather people around him that knew something about the job. And he'd sort of sit looking at the job quietly. People would be rather timid around him, sort of thing. And they would make various comments, and he would comment back. If he didn't like what people said, he'd go a bit red at the back of the neck, and everything would be very quiet for a bit. And occasionally, people would bring a bit of paper and show him, and he'd look at it rather critically. If he didn't like it, he'd sort of push it over the end of the bench.
When Mitchell turned his attention to producing a fighter, it is entirely logical that he produced something like a Spitfire. In fact, it would have been rather surprising if he hadn't.
Air Marshal Dowding invited Vickers Supermarine and Mitchell to design a fighter, but in the peaceful 30s, the government had little enthusiasm for defense. They ignored the ominous rabble rising in Germany, where a nation was being harnessed to a war machine training in secret. Britain's ancient biplane fighters were slower than the Luftwaffe's bombers. The RAF needed more killing power.
Scott and Leader Sawley worked out in tremendous detail and technically that with the rate of fire and the number of guns you had, that a 2-second burst was the ideal short burst as you were coming into the attack astern of an enemy aircraft. You were overtaking pretty fast usually. 2 seconds when you came in range of 200 yards was about the ideal time to push the button and all the guns fire.
Mitchell drew on his own experience with the RAF high-speed flight and turned to his friends at Rolls-Royce. They were already developing a new breed of aero engine.
We were hoping, of course, that we would get an airplane that would do at least 300 miles an hour. And of course, there was great excitement in the drawing office at the prospects of designing an engine that would produce the power required produce that speed. At that time, of course, we had the Kestrel engine. We felt that we wanted a somewhat larger engine. We had the engine known as the R, which was the engine that won Schneider Trophy in 1929, but that was a 20% scale up dimensionally of the Kestrel engine, but was thought at that time to be rather too big, so we decided that we would want an engine that was somewhere intermediate between the Kestrel and the R. And this was how the Merlin engine came to be started.
Rolls-Royce built this 12-cylinder engine, the Merlin, as a private venture. R.J. Mitchell of Supermarine chose it for the Spitfire. Sidney Cam of Hawkers chose it for the Hurricane. The Hurricane first flew in November 1935 and went immediately into production. The Spitfire first flew at Eastleigh on the 5th of March 1936. This prototype was the first of 20,300 Spitfires and over 2,000 Seafires. R.J. Mitchell sat with his team more tense than he looked. There were two test pilots, Geoffrey Quill on the right and Mutt Summers, who first flew the Spitfire.
And then Mutt Summers took off, and it wasn't long before he disappeared completely from view in the heavens above. And after a suitable interval, he returned, and he made a very characteristic side-slip landing, which on a new aeroplane was perhaps a bit surprising.
Jumped out of the aeroplane, and I think R.J. stepped forward and expected some figures on a piece of paper. And Mutt Summers said, it's a good aeroplane.
He said, I don't want anything touched, by which he meant he was quite happy to fly it again on the next flight without anything done to it at all. And he was he was obviously delighted with the aeroplane. Well, I was very fortunate that I got the job of flying the Spitfire when he was to perhaps take off in the morning. And obviously Mitchell had a system, somebody rang him up and said the aircraft's airborne. By the time I used to get back into the circuit, first thing I used to look down and as I was on the circuit, and I would nearly always see old Mitchell's yellow Rolls-Royce, either just driving in through the gate or parked on the tarmac. And as soon as I taxied in, he was always there, the sort of debriefing people used to come around, but old Mitchell was always around, hovering around in the background. If we were going to fly it again, he always used to invite me to go and sit in his car and talk to him, or sometimes we'd go off and have a cup of coffee.
And I well remember him jokingly taking a bet with one of the test pilots, I think it was, that the Spitfire would exceed the speed of the Hurricane by at least 30 miles an hour. And of course, this was all taken very lightheartedly, but events showed that this was certainly a good bet.
Why was the Spitfire faster than the Hurricane? Well, Mitchell knew from his Schneider Trophy experience that frontal area had to be cut down, and he determined on the thinnest possible wings for the Spitfire, clad in stressed aluminium. The wing had to be thick enough to contain the wheels when retracted and to carry 8 303 machine guns for either side. Add fuel tanks and controls, and you can see it would have been easier to have a thicker wing. And Mitchell was told that having a thinner wing wouldn't make very much difference. But he insisted on the perfect aerofoil shape, and history proved him right.
In 1933, it was discovered that my father had cancer, and he had to go into hospital and have a major operation. It left him with a very grave physical disability, and also, of course, he knew that there was every chance that the illness would reoccur, and he was told that if it occurred within 4 years, there was nothing probably that could be done. And I think the relevant point is that it was during this period when he designed the Spitfire and later still the 4-engine bomber, which was designed and put into building the prototype, but was subsequently destroyed in an air raid over Southampton. But it was towards the end of 1936 that it became obvious that my father was far from well, and in fact it was soon realized that the cancer had returned. And although he bravely continued and went to Vienna for special treatment in May of 1937, but he returned and he died about 3 weeks later.
Mitchell's giant bomber was never produced. The Spitfire was his dynamic epitaph. In 1936, Hitler chose a fighter for his new Luftwaffe. It was the Bf 109 designed by Willy Messerschmitt, cheap to build and very fast. In 1937, it broke the world's land plane record at 380 miles an hour, using an engine souped up almost to destruction. Goering and Messerschmitt let the world believe it was their standard fighter. Hitler gave highest priority to bombers, and he failed to produce sufficient fighters. He hoped for cooperation with Britain. Indeed, the Luftwaffe actually disclosed true production figures to the RAF. The Luftwaffe's General Milch visited our aircraft factories. His diary notes the consternation he caused by asking, "How are your experiments with the radio detection of aircraft?" The Luftwaffe's Stukas and Messerschmitts were blooded in the Spanish Civil War. Dive bombers were fitted with screaming sirens to add terror to destruction. The Blitzkrieg machine was tuned for war. The Royal Air Force trained new pilots on Hurricanes and Spitfires. Clearly, there was not to be peace in our time. After the Munich crisis of 1938, auxiliaries and reservists were writing a new chapter of air history.
I would hate to have gone to war myself in 1938 because I wasn't trained. And I think the year we had between Munich and 1939 just gave us the time to get things better organized, get more fighter squadrons, better trained, that sort of thing. And I think had we have fought in 1938, the outcome might have been a lot different. There were 5,000 of we chaps in the 5,000 embryo pilots in the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve in the summer of 1939, and we all wanted to be fighter pilots to fly the Spitfire.
But the RAF had only one squadron of Spitfires, 5 squadrons of Hurricanes, and 23 squadrons with outdated aircraft. Spitfires were slow to come from the production lines. Vickers Supermarine was struggling with an order for 310. They had never tackled more than 25 aircraft at once. They were craftsmen, skilled in making seaplanes and flying boats, not mass-produced fighters of revolutionary design.
Well, I remember in 1938, the foreman came along and said, "You chaps will all be working like hell in the near future." This was at what turned out to be the time of the Munich crisis. And that was our first indication, really, that things were going to be really tough. They had a building problem because of the elliptical wing. It's much more difficult to build than straight wings, obviously. The aeroplane derived its main strength, as far as the wing was concerned, from the D-torsion leading edge.
The leading edge here is formed of aluminium and the dimensions are critical. The wing at first was difficult to make. Indeed, at one time, Vickers Supermarine at Southampton had completed fuselages lying around waiting for the wings, which the subcontractor was unable to deliver. The Hurricane, easier to build, was available in greater numbers at the outbreak of war. By the spring of 1939, the countdown to war had started, and the balance of air power was more even.
Urgent arrangements was made for Supermarine to increase their plant at that time, which was nothing like for the requirements for an order of this size. Orders was placed in Germany and also in other parts of Europe. And I recall with quite amusement now that in 1939, and the week the war was declared, a German was installing a Horser jig borer, which the company had purchased, and he had to be escorted from the gate to the machine and then got out of the place as quick as possible.
The Poles fell to the Blitzkrieg. The Messerschmitts destroyed their air force, and Goebbels fostered the myth of German supremacy. But thanks to their Spitfires and Hurricanes, the morale of Britain's fighter pilots was high, not least when Douglas Bader rejoined the RAF.
I say, you never forget her, Bob. I mean, I remember this when I sit in this cockpit and look at the instruments and so on. I mean, one's back home again, you know. I could fly this thing if you take the hangar down and start it, you know, without any trouble. They were a lovely aeroplane. They still look about the prettiest thing that's ever been built. I mean, jets included. And you see, that wonderful chap, Mitchell, who designed this aeroplane, I think it was awfully sad that he didn't live to see what it did for his country. Because apart from the superlative design, it has been, and always was, marvelously built. If you're always flying an aeroplane where not only bullets from the enemy are going to destroy you, but if you aren't careful, the wing will fold up, I think it makes a great deal of difference to morale, you know.
The first dogfights between the Me-109 and the Spitfire and Hurricane took place in the spring of 1940 over the Channel in France. A Messerschmitt was captured intact and taken to Boscombe Down. To compare it with the Spitfire, the Me-109 was flown by Wing Commander Stanford Tuck and George Stainforth, who had piloted the Schneider Trophy planes. The Hurricanes were slower than the Messerschmitts, the Spitfires just faster.
Well, I thought it was a first-class fighter aircraft. It was very similar to our Spitfire, a little better than our Hurricane, but very similar to our Spitfire. And in the comparison trials that George Stainforth and I did, the results were one had little advantages over the other and vice versa. This fighter basically had to escort the German bombers over here. And the fuel consumption was, of course, very high for this type of aircraft with a powerful engine. And if it had to fly very slowly at the speed of the bombers, the pilots were constantly using throttle, which was using more fuel, as opposed to operating at A, their best altitude, and B, their best throttle setting. So the Messerschmitt pilots, the 109s, doing their escort to their bombers, I felt were always at a tremendous disadvantage.
The supermarine experts, now under Joe Smith, fought their own battle for airspeed. Supermarine were proud of their flush riveting, but in mass production, mushroom-headed rivets would be quicker and easier. But would these sticking out rivets so increase the drag as to reduce the speed? A vital question in view of the performance of the Messerschmitt 109. Well, there was only one way to find out. Split peas were stuck over the heads of the flush rivets to simulate mushroom riveting, and the aeroplane was then taken off and its maximum speed very carefully measured. And then, row by row, the split peas were removed from the flush riveting and comparative measurements of speed were made. They reached a compromise. If the leading edge there were flush riveted, they gained 12 miles an hour. Other places could acceptably be mushroom riveted in the interests of economy and speed of production.
Now, on the prototype, they just shot the exhaust out sideways. The important thing was thought to get the exhaust well clear and so it didn't get to the pilot. But it was later realized, and in the Schneider Trophy too, we did that. But later it was realized that you get jet propulsion out of the exhaust. It was being shot out at considerable speed, and if you could turn it backwards, it would in fact give you quite a lot of increase in speed. And in fact, compared with our prototype, the aeroplane, in the form we've got it here, for instance, these sort of jets, would go about 20 to 25 miles an hour faster.
Farnborough streamlined the radiator and used waste heat to give jet propulsion to balance out the radiator's drag. Later, a curved shoulder windscreen gained 5 miles an hour, and adding doors to the retractable wheels won another 6. Eventually, the tail wheel was made retractable to speed up the Spitfire by another 5 miles an hour. But there was one unexpected defect in the carburetor.
Now, I'm a German pilot here, flying on Messerschmitt 109. This one has Richthoffen's markings on it. But if I saw an attack from a Hurricane or a Spitfire developing behind me, due to the engine that I got, which had direct fuel injection, it wasn't worried of negative G. So my immediate evasive action would be just to stick my nose straight down as fast as I could and accelerate away.
And you see, I'm behind him about to shoot him down, and he does that. Now, I've got an ordinary carburettor in this Spitfire, so when I push the stick forward, all the petrol flow goes away from the carburettor, and the airplane goes pop, bang, all this sort of banging and so on, and things come out from the bottom of the cockpit, you know, the spanners, the people left on the floor and so on, and dust and stuff. So that is no good. Now, what we evolved was somehow we'd got to keep the gravy in the carburettor, you know, and so we used to do a half roll like that to keep the negative G, which meant you were going down with your back to him and then roll round and hope
that you were in behind him.
That you could see him. Now, usually, of course, he was way about running like a lamplighter, you know, you couldn't get him. But we did discover, and Bobble shows that if you saw him and stayed behind him, although you weren't anywhere near him, that he pulled out of the dive rather early. And then you could do that across him, get behind him again.
Cut the corner,
and do it. This was the point. The reason was that a very famous German pilot had pulled the wings off a 109, pulling out for speed or pulling out too hard. And we reckoned that this had gone round the German Air Force. And they'd been told to be pretty sort of porky with pulling the lever back, you know, when they were going very fast. And it made a tremendous difference. Although our manoeuvre looks complicated, I mean, Bob will agree with me, actually after a bit you got frightfully good at it, you know, so that you could nip around, and he was still there, but a bit further away.
When the pilot turned into a dive to follow the Messerschmitt, or a bunt if you like, the fuel was thrown to the top of the carburettor, and the engine momentarily was starved of fuel and cut, power cut. And this was a disadvantage. By the time the thing had recovered, the Messerschmitt had gone. And this was cured initially in a very simple way by a famous lady engineer from the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Miss Schilling, and she put a small thing about the size of a penny with a hole through it, and we called it Miss Schilling's orifice, I remember at the time. This was a partial cure. Subsequently, the thing was cured completely by a development here of Cyril Lovesey's into a new carburettor called the diaphragm carburettor. Now, we never went for petrol injection because putting the fuel in before the supercharger, when it evaporates, it cools the air and increases the performance of the supercharger. So we gain more power that way, and we always stuck to putting the fuel in before the supercharger.
In the fighter-to-fighter duels, the Spitfire and Hurricane drew on one more asset. They could both outturn the Messerschmitt.
See, in the Spitfire, all I do, and I got a 109 behind me, was simply to do a steep turn like that, and he can't get inside me to shoot. Now, Bob, you get hold of both of them and explain it, will you?
Well, now, I'm the Messerschmitt here, coming down, and I'm attacking the Spitfire. Now, the Spitfire has a remarkably good rate of turn, better than the Messerschmitt. Now, as they're turning steeply, the Messerschmitt, to shoot at the Spitfire, has got to really aim there, ahead of the Spitfire, because it's turning fast, what we call a deflection shot. But the Messerschmitt can't turn as quickly as the Spitfire, so therefore all his shots are going astern here.
After the evacuation of Dunkirk, Goering realized that the RAF fighter force must be destroyed before Germany could invade Britain. But he underestimated the build-up of our fighter production. German fighters in France were now within range of London, and the Luftwaffe prepared for the last act of the Blitzkrieg drama. They were soon to discover that Dad's army was not the only star turn in Britain.
Who do you think you are kidding, Mr. Hitler, if you think we're on the run? We are the boys who will stop your little game. We are the boys who will make you think again. 'Cause who do you think you are kidding, Mr. Hitler, if you think old England's done?